So it appears that President Trump is planning on pardoning people convicted or alleged of committing war crimes. So some of these individuals are Special Ops Chief Edward Gallagher, a Navy SEAL, Major Matthew Goldstein, an Army Green Beret, among some of the people he plans to trump. Gallagher was arrested in September on more than a dozen charges and is accused of having shot at unarmed forces and killing a teen ISIS prisoner with a knife, who this teen ISIS prisoner was wounded and dying, and Gallagher kept repeatedly stabbing him, as well as posing with the body. He's charged with premeditated murder, premeditated murder and attempted murder, along with other charges. He's pled not guilty to all these charges. Goldstein, if I'm saying his name right, is charged with premeditated murder for shooting and killing an unarmed Afghani man in 2010. And then Trump also plans to pardon Nicholas A. Slayton, who has been convicted twice of first-degree murder for his role in a 2007 shooting in Baghdad, Iraq, that killed 14 Iraqi civilians, as well as as well as wounding 17 more, and basically a shooting rampage that took place. And a little bit more on this Mr. Gallagher. Charges also include shooting a teenage girl and a unarmed old man from a sniper's nest, repeatedly firing a machine gun into a residential neighborhood, and again, that teen ISIS fighter, a wounded prisoner who he repeatedly stabbed, yet that teen was wounded and dying. So it's very interesting to see the people that President Trump plans to pardon for some who have been convicted of some very heinous crimes, or who are alleged to have committed some very heinous crimes, and yet his Justice Department is actively going after whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, like Julian Assange, or I should say journalists like Julian Assange. And, how about pardon people like Edward Snowden, real true patriots who exposed the crimes and misdeeds of our government, exposed the extensive illegal spying that they were doing on our citizens, as well as the other citizens of the world. Instead, he is focusing his pardon powers on people like the ones that I just mentioned, the Edward Gallagher and Matthew Goldstein and Nicholas A. Slayton. The latter, Slayton, has been twice convicted of first-degree murder. Gallagher was charged back in September of, like I said, premeditated murder and attempted murder, along with other crimes. Goldstein was also charged with premeditated murder as well, and just some of the descriptions I gave you could see these were some really heinous acts that either these people were convicted of or are charged of. So why not at least the ones that were charged, let them have their day in court, to see what our justice system has to say about that. But just on the face of it, this Mr. Gallagher, this Navy SEAL, is charged with shooting an unarmed teenager from a sniper's nest. He's also charged with shooting an unarmed old Iraqi man from the sniper's nest. He's charged with repeatedly stabbing a wounded who was on basically dying, and teen ISIS prisoner. Goldstein, he is charged with premeditated murder for his killing of a Iraqi civilian. So I don't know. It's just very interesting and troubling when the president of the United States has this power to pardon people for their crimes or misdeeds, or people who maybe should never have been charged with a crime or persecuted in the first place, like Julian Assange, like Edward Snowden, like Chelsea Manning, like all of the kind of political prisoners of our past. He could use his power for good. Instead, he is using it to try to get these people who have committed these war crimes, these atrocities against civilians and teenagers and prisoners of war off the hook for the heinous things that they did during wartime. And I think it's just another good example of why we shouldn't be jumping into wars, into these interventionist regime change, type of actions as a country, as a foreign policy, because when we are put into those positions, really horrible and just sick and sadistic things like this end up happening. That's why we need a real foreign policy that puts peace and humanitarian aid and diplomacy above all of this other stuff, because if we go to war, stuff like this is going to end up happening. Peace.